this is Elizabeth from Psychology for Geeks. And today I had a really awesome conversation with Stephanie. She's from TODOS Therapy. And we just geeked out a lot about mental health and just geek culture, like lots of things in the geek culture. And we had a long chat about how you can open your own private practice, her own experience opening her own private practice and doing like sort of geek therapy, or like, incorporating elements of the geek culture into her practice. And we also talked about mental health and stigma and social media and all of that. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hi, everyone. Today I am joined by Stephanie, and we will be talking about her experience opening up her own private practice and using geek culture in her sessions. Hi, how are you?
Thanks. Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Really excited for this collaboration and the other ones we have planned as well. Can you tell us a little bit about your practice?
Yeah. So my private practice is called TODOS Therapy. TODOS is an acronym which stands for Together Overcoming and Demystifying the Other's Struggles. I know it's a mouthful. That's why I made it TODOS Therapy. I really wanted to emphasize like what the other, and I have like a whole article on that on my blog and my About Me page. But basically, my private practice is really for the person who just doesn't fit in, and whatever that means. I started it during the pandemic. Actually, it's like going into the 2nd year anniversary, and yeah, love it. As for, geek therapy, that's kind of like what I've been pushing for since I opened. Even before I opened my private practice, I was always known for like, yeah, let's talk about music, let's talk about books, let's talk about movies, let's talk about the things that you like instead of, this therapy thing. Let's just talk about you and what you're into, and figuring out like what you need to do and, to connect.
Well, it must have been like, I can't move on from the fact that you opened it during that pandemic. Like, how was that process like?
What I've been telling my friends who are considering private practice right now is don't do what I did.
Okay.
I started with 2 clients. I'd been working with nonprofit for many years at that point, and the pandemic happened, and I was like, if it's not going to happen now, it's never going to happen. So I started with 2 clients, built my caseload from there. It was nerve-wracking. It was a lot of doubt, but yeah, eventually clients started trickling in. I started connecting with other therapists in private practice world, and yeah, I'm surprised it kind of worked out the way that it did. So yeah, those who want to take a chance, I wish you luck, but yeah, just don't do what I did if you're not, ready to like, with all the doubt and all the like second guessing.
Well, I think just opening up your own sort of business, your own practice, that's a lot of like just nerves and doubt and like, what do we do? Because I don't know what your program was like, but mine doesn't teach us anything like that. And the programs that I've seen out there where they're like, oh yeah, it's a weekend, seminar on how to open your and grow your own private practice. And that's like $500. And I'm like, wait, I don't have that kind of money as a student. And even like afterwards, I feel like. So yeah.
That's the unfortunate side of this, of us getting our master's degree. Like, and I remember one of my professors saying we would all benefit from taking business class or some kind of marketing class or something in that realm. And I didn't know what she meant. And now I know, because when I started advertising, like, hey, I'm new to private practice, would love to connect, I got so bombarded with coaching deals. Like, hey, I'm a coach, let me help you. This is my fee. And I'm like, I just want a community. Like, I don't have this money to like consult with you or coach with you right now. Like, yeah.
Right. Yeah. There was so I think it was yesterday I was talking to someone and I sort of like in passing mentioned that I wanted to open my own private practice, and she said like, oh, so are you majoring both in like psychology and business? And I was like, that would have been smart, but
Yeah.
no. And I'm like, I'm just sort of like, I guess I'll figure out as I go, because there's like, I mean, as a student it's really hard to like save up money, like to hire someone, I know maybe eventually you might be possible to do that, but like when you first start or when you like just graduated, there's like, no way for something like that. And um, I think my fear has always been like trying to reach out to someone and asking me like, hey, can you need advice about, opening your own private practice? And people being like either saying, oh yeah, here's my fee for this consult, or like, oh yeah, just Google it, or, like just being waved off and like not being provided with any, helpful information. So I never reached out to anybody before about it, which is why I kind of was so interested in making these videos, because I feel like there is so much need for so many different types of therapists out there. Like we don't have to like fight over like clients or anything like that. In fact, we need more people like for referrals and stuff, because it's impossible for us to see everyone.
Yeah, and I totally get it. And I'm still like, again, 2 years in, I'm still asking for advice. I'm still trying to figure it out. And it is a lot of like, is this person really going to help me? Am I going to come off as a loafer? Because I don't have the funds for like that. I think recently I reached out just for some advice, and they came back with, well, my consultation fee is like $250. And I'm like, whoa, let me get back to you because I just paid my taxes, and then I'll circle back because eventually I do want to link up with them. But yeah, just when you're first starting out, like you don't have that kind of funds. You are just looking for people.
You're like 200, 250 for like the whole year or something.
For an hour, I'm like, man, like I want to get to your level. I want to be able to feel comfortable being like, well, my time is money kind of thing. I'm getting there, but I'm not quite there. you know but right now I am very reliant on, like, if I can find something on YouTube, if I can find something on Facebook. I'm on like so many Facebook groups. If I'm trying to build like my whole thing on Instagram, like I'm just trying to see like if I can piecemeal this whole idea of like how to market, how to put yourself out there, how to network. Like that's where the business mentality comes in. But yeah, I wish, you know, if I had the chance to like rewind and take like a business class back in the day, I probably would have.
That makes me think too, because like in my practicums and like internships, I always come across people who are like, well, desperate need of like therapy for, for children or for the parents, for the whole family, but they don't have the funds for that. And then I'm like, I wish there were so many programs out there. And sometimes I come across a post that says, oh, here's different ways that you can get reduced fees for therapy and stuff like that. And then I'm like, oh, I can't really imagine having to ask people to pay or to turn people away because they can't afford it. Is that something you've sort of like come across in the past years?
Yeah, and I think I have discussed it with a lot of people who come from like the nonprofit world, because when we all start in this, we all want to just help people. We all want to
Mhm.
like, quote unquote, save the world in our own way. But sometimes you got to be able to ask yourself, like, is this what's going to pay the bills? You know? And there is a median ground. Like I live in an area, I live in the Bay Area. Rent over here is pretty high. So compared to other places, I do have to charge a little bit more, but that's only because cost of living. I gotta be able to find the compromise. And I have been able to find a middle ground. Like I live in an area where people can afford my fee. And I'm hoping to incorporate, like, be on a couple insurance panels, that I can see more people, and it's a little bit more affordable. Um, but yeah, there's always this like gut wrenching question of like, am I doing the right thing? On this person can't afford my fee, so I have to send them elsewhere. And it's hard. It's a hard question I always have to ask myself.
Yeah, and like I see, because I'm so like sort of like in social media all the time. I see a lot of posts about people sort of complaining about how expensive it is, and I'm like, well, we kind of have to make a living as well, and we have so many years of school, we have a bunch of student loans we have to pay back, and like it kind of is a struggle. Like we wish we could offer services for more people for less money, but there has to be that happy medium. We have to find that happy medium, something that we're comfortable with, and it will allow us to sort of like live on that.
Yeah, and this is where like networking can be beneficial. So if they can't work with me just solely because of price, then maybe I can send them to like a nonprofit agency or a program or a therapist who does have sliding scale options. Because I do have sliding scale, but it's very limited. But maybe someone I know has a little bit more availability than I do in that price range. I'll send them that way. And it's like, if you're able to trust me, I trust this person, so you can trust them too. So that's where that whole networking thing can come into play, but it is hard.
Yeah, and you also mentioned the other aspect too, like being able to schedule people, because when I was doing an internship, there was a lot of people who were like, well, do you have appointments on the weekends or after like 6 o'clock? And I
Right.
was like, no. I had like, because I worked there only like certain days or whatever, like I had a schedule that I needed to keep. And then I'm like, but even for my own sort of mental health, I'm like, I can't be available all the time. So there has to be like boundaries set for that as well, which I think starting out, it's when you find it a little bit difficult to do that.
Yeah, and I still question that. So my like client hours or office hours, I have Fridays off. I knew going in, Fridays off was going to benefit me. If anything, it's more of a catch up day. Instead of seeing clients, that's where I do my notes. That's where I do my phone calls. But I do not see clients that day, And people were first like, why would you do that? Like, why would you not? You're starting out. Like, why would you limit your office hours, quote unquote? I'm like, for my mental health, Fridays are my days, you know, because there may be a
Mhm.
time where I don't want to do that paperwork or I don't want to make those phone calls and I can just go out for a walk. I can just enjoy my time at the cafe. And that's what I need to do. So Monday or over the weekend, I'm somewhat rested, you know? But yeah, there have been a few times where it's like, I really only have Fridays. And I'm like, sorry, I can't see you. But I know this other person who may have Fridays, or I know this one person who has like Saturday mornings available. Let's see if they have availability for you.
Yes, that's why I like connecting with other people, especially like other, geek therapists or nerd therapists out there, like other people who just love incorporating like geek culture into the therapy session, because there's not a lot of us out there. I have been trying to like reach out and connect with people for a while. So I'm like, oh yeah, wait, there are, a good number of us out there, but we just happen to be like in different countries and like all over the US, kind of thing. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you incorporate like geek culture into your therapy sessions?
Yeah. So one of the first few questions I ask my client is like, what movies or music do you listen to? Movies and music are like my top two, like I'm most knowledgeable in that realm.
Mhm.
And then books are like, or comic books are like third on the list. So yeah, what I generally just ask, like, what are you into? Like, what do you listen to? What are you watching? Like, and then we kind of develop a conversation, and I try to connect some themes. I try to see like, oh, you seem to like, this particular protagonist in manga. Like you seem to like, YA novels. Like, tell me more about that. Like, just try to have a conversation. And I find it's a very safe conversation to have when you're meeting a client for the first time.
Definitely. It makes it a lot easier, I think, because, we kind of talk about like amongst us, other therapists and like even to the clients, how, that relationship you have with the therapist is kind of like one of the main things that, that we're looking, and talking about something that we both enjoy doing. It makes it a lot easier, because then oh, this person's kind of like me, they know what I'm talking about, especially when it's something. Have you ever encountered clients who are kind of a little reluctant to talk about what it is that they geek about, because maybe they've been made fun of, or it's not something you talk about like with other people?
Yeah, and I share a little antidote. Like, look, in sixth grade, when Britney Spears and Backstreet Boys were very popular, I was listening to 80s pop music and funk. Like that's where I was at, and that, again, like my approach is always like little sarcastic, little humorous. So I'm always starting on that front, and I'm very conscious of that. So hopefully, because I present that and I give that little antidote, I'm showing myself to my clients, then they're able to be like, oh, I'm not as weird, or at least I'm not as weird as Stephanie. Like what I'm talking about is like not that embarrassing, and I have no problem embarrassing myself if I need to.
That's one of the things, like I just sort of like always remember one of the main things, like almost every professor slash supervisor, they're like, don't talk about yourself, don't tell the clients anything about you. And I'm like, oh, how am I supposed to connect with them if I don't say anything? I'm like, it's like super awkward, like, and I can just imagine how awkward it would be for them just to like need to talk about like these really difficult things that they need to process, or like, past trauma or whatever, with a complete stranger who like doesn't show any emotions, doesn't have any reactions or anything, kind of what, like, what the textbooks say, or the professors. And I was like, oh, I don't like that. I don't like that idea at all. And the more I sort of gain experience, I guess, the more I realized it was just a lot easier to have like a 5-minute brief conversation, like geek out with someone about like the movie that just came out or something that they love, or like a video game, even if it wasn't something that I was like a fan of, like, or that I knew I had that much knowledge. Like it just makes them feel more comfortable, which is ultimately what we want, for them to feel comfortable with us and discuss things. And Geek
And
Culture makes it
I
easier.
Yeah, and like the kind of clients I work with, which are teens and young adults, they're especially young teens, they're typically not in a position to teach adults, or they're not used to adults talking about their interests. So the fact that I'm someone who's like, no, tell me, like teach me, like show me this way, more than happy to listen to it. They're just like, I will take this opportunity and show you all kinds of weird if I need to, like, because no one else is asking these questions. I'm always very surprised by that, because some of the stuff I'm like, dude, that's cool. Let's talk about that. Like, you want to start a zine? Let's find those resources. You want to, like, I don't know, you're interested in music production? Like, let's talk about that. Like, where's this passion for music come from?
Just thinking back to my own like teen years, and I'm like, that was the one like awkward, well, even now, but like that was the one awkward age where I was like, I have, like, nobody's really interested in what I have to say. And like the adults, I think, around sometimes they're like, oh well, you don't have much experience with things, so your opinion is nice, but that, yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
you're there. Like, you're,
yeah, yes, but
like,
you're fine, adults are talking now,
yeah,
kind of thing, yeah.
because again, I'm big consumer of like just anything nerd or nerd like. And if you, as someone who, just as a person, like you find something passion, like you find passion in it, you find something intriguing, I'm going to be curious about it. And I think that along the way, adults kind of lose that. I'm noticing, like, I call it like the whimsy. As children, like we have the whimsy, we're imaginative, we have no problem like talking to someone and be like, oh yeah, tell me about this thing that you like. Adults, like, we don't really do that. Like, no one really talks about that in that way. We're not fascinated by simple things. And I wish if more people were like that, like, I don't know, I think we'd just be in a better place.
I agree. That's the one thing that I've one of the reasons why I enjoy working with children and teens so much, because they still have that let's have fun kind of mentality. Like fun is needs to be in my schedule at some point, like throughout the day. And as adults, we just sort of get bogged down with all kinds of responsibilities, and we're like, yeah, we don't have time for play. And I'm like, that's when you need the play the most. Yeah.
I remember like a few years ago, and it was like the saddest article I ever read, but like actual like physicians or MDs were prescribing playtime to children. Because at least in this area, like where I'm at, I'm in Silicon Valley, we have a lot of like high power couples, like very much like you need to go to Stanford or bust kind of mentality. But these children, they get so overworked at a young age. Like they have to go to Mandarin class, they have to go to fencing class, they have to like get like all these straight A's, and they're busy at like age 10. So doctors were like, you need playtime, like unstructured, un like just playful playtime, you know? And the fact that it was on like a doctor's script note was like, we've come to this, like, this is where we're at right now. Really?
You know, I kind of forgot what you were saying earlier, but there was something that you said that I was like, wait, we kind of have forgotten how powerful it is for us to play and to geek out. Like there's so much we can learn. Oh yes, I remember now. You were talking about like, you know, how powerful it is sometimes for teenagers to teach you something, right? And for you to be interested in what they're talking about. And I'm like, that teaches them confidence, right? Like for them to be confident talking about something that they love, which then they can carry on, like, you know, school projects or work or profession. But there's so many things that we can learn from playtime and from geeking out with other people that we kind of dismiss it because it's not something that we see right away.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. And I think people they misinterpret what play is. And I think in our society, like if it's not productive, it's not important. You know, at least in American society, like you need to always be working, you know? But where I find play is like, or even like what I call like the whimsy is like, you can find a value set in there. Like you reading comics, like reading, like understanding the meaning behind lyrics, or, you know, reading a graphic novel, like you can find very important messages in there. Like you can actually connect with a very big picture or humanity as a whole. And I wish more people would take it more seriously, but instead it's art, and art isn't as important as work, you know? So I just don't get it.
I am really glad about the level of I guess exposure that some movies are getting, especially when it comes to like mental health, like, you
Yes.
know, the movie Encanto, that was just like everybody like, and also like Turning Red as well. Yeah, those movies that everybody got everyone to start talking about like their own experiences and start learning and, you know, making TikToks and stuff. And I'm like, yes, we need more of that. And I'm like, see, it's helpful, it's good. And I'm like, we need more movies like that.
Yeah. And Disney likes to just make us cry. You know? Yeah. No, and I'm so glad like a lot of adults, like a lot of my adult clients are even watching those movies and they're like, wait, I'm not the only one who dealt with this. Like, this is not like an isolated thing. And I now have an avenue to talk about, you know, my family about this, or just a way to start the conversation about stuff that happened in the past. Very fascinating stuff. And I'm very excited to like incorporate that in my sessions.
Since you work with teens, do you ever get pushback from parents maybe thinking, well, you're not really doing therapy because you're geeking out with, you know, with the teen more often than not?
It's never really been brought up. I always think that sometimes, like, was I really beneficial? Was that time really well spent with my client? But the fact that they keep coming back, and this is more of a way to like open the door to start talking about deeper stuff or more reasons on why they're coming to therapy in the first place, those kind of questions or concerns kind of go away, you know? As for parents, the pushback is more because I do look so young, or I come off as very young initially, or I do, like, again, this is like my setup when I do meet parents, they're just like, how long you been doing this? Like, how long,
You have any kids?
like, yeah, do you have any kids? Like, you sure you're the one that's gonna like fix my kid? And it's always kind of working with that kind of conversation and trying to build the trust on that. And generally, eventually the kid does get better, so they kind of trust the process a little bit more. You know, I don't know if they like buy the whole fact, like, I've been doing this almost a decade now, and but I can still like have the whimsy. But eventually, like, they start to realize, like, yeah, my kid's like really talking to me more, you know, like I didn't notice, or I didn't know like they were struggling that much in the beginning.
Mhm.
So eventually that starts to happen, and I'm like, awesome, you held out. Like, that's the whole point.
Um, I've gotten some like pushback or some blank look sometimes when I mention like, talking about movies or playing with clients. Or there was this one time where I think we were supposed to do like a process group or something, and it got changed, and it was with adults, and
Mhm.
it got changed, and I was like, oh, we're just gonna color. And it was like, what?
What?
Like that reaction was like, you expect us to color? Like, what do you want us to color? And I was like, whatever you want. And at first there was like that hesitance of like, I guess. And then I just kind of like, pushing something like, it'd be fun. You do this. And then it became like, it was this very calm and sort of present atmosphere where everybody was like coloring, and like, it just, it was such a powerful thing to see like a group of adults just coloring. And I'm like, it's just a simple thing that we kind of push aside or forget or even dismiss, right? I started learning more about tabletop role playing games because my brother had been talking about it for like years, and
Mhm.
like half of me was like only half listening, and I was like, yeah, that's nice,
That's
that's
cool.
nice. And then I came across a video that was like, oh, it's actually really good for like building social skills, and I was like, what? Excuse me? It's good for something? I was like, wait, what? And then I was like, oh no, I was doing the same thing that everybody else was doing. I was dismissing something only because I thought it had no value, or like I wasn't interested in it. And like the more I learn about it, and I'm like, it's so cool.
No, it is. I'm not an expert in tabletop games, but like I've played D&D a few times. I understand like the imagination of it, like the passion behind it, the math skills it takes to be a part of that game. Like you have to, knowing your history, especially like Middle Ages, if that's where you're at, or just like coming up with ideas on the fly, like you have to cognitively, like there's so many things at play whenever you're doing a campaign. And I respect that. Not really my thing, but if someone wants to talk to me about it and be like, yeah, this is what my character is, and this is how many critical points I had, let's talk about it. If you want to talk about your avatar and you don't want to talk about like stuff with family or stuff about yourself, but it's your avatar you're more comfortable with, let's stick with that a little bit, and see if we can kind of just get more comfortable, talking about yourself. But that's the process. Like you build on that, because most likely that client, you know, they're just more comfortable in that world. That world is safe, and that's what they're comfortable sharing with you. Why wouldn't I take that opportunity, to understand it and really ask questions about it and be curious about it? And I wish more parents understood that.
Right. Yes. And like maybe getting away a little bit from having to prescribe playtime. Sometimes I get resistance from parents where I was like, well, do you play with your children? And they're like, no. And I'm like, well, that's very important. That's when you can teach them so many things, and you can form a connection and bond, and it just allowed them to sort of feel safe. It's like, it's a language, right? That you speak. And if somebody else is sort of interested in that language that you're speaking, then it makes you feel seen and, feel so much better. And I'm like, we need that. We need that. Like if you're wanting to, have a better connection with your spouse, with your children, with your siblings, with your parents, do something they enjoy, and then you'll see the magic happen. Like you don't have to, like, have serious in-depth conversations all the time.
Yeah. And who's to say like that won't open the door for other conversations that could be happening because you proved yourself like you can handle this kind of conversation. Then maybe that teen or that child will be like, okay, I can talk to you about this other thing I have on my mind. you know
Right.
it's
Yeah.
building the foundation for all those other important things.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier that I absolutely love was that you asked them, like you asked your clients, like, what is it that you geek out about? Or like, what is it that you love?
Mhm.
And I think it gets missed, the fact that geek culture is kind of like a culture, like it's a real thing, kind of like, people identifying as Mexican or identifying as French or whatever, like if you identify as something, that's part of who you are.
Mhm.
Have you ever had conversations with parents or some of your clients about feeling comfortable just showing their inner geek or nerd?
I think it's a lot easier now. Like when I was in school, no, like that was a very niche thing. Like it was kind of weird. I went to school like in the like late 90s, early 2000s. So there, like if you were a Marvel fan or a DC fan, people would be like, what the hell is that? You know, like back then, like the Tim Burton Batman movie was only catered to like the geeks who had been fans of like Star Wars or, you know, generations prior. So to have like a new generation of geeks back then, it's kind of weird. And to have it talked about with your friends, still weird. You know, so it's a very niche thing. Nowadays, I'm noticing like if you're not at least familiar with the Marvel movies or the new Batman movie, that's kind of weird. You don't necessarily have to be a fan of the comics, but if you're not a fan of like some kind of superhero movie, that's kind of weird.
Well, then I guess let me ask you this, like the opposite. Have you ever had clients who felt left out because they had no interest in all the geeky things that are becoming very popular?
I'm seeing that more with like the like if you're a fan of anime or manga a little bit more, like that's still it's more it's a little bit more popular, but still it's a very niche thing when you're talking about it. Like I'm finding those are like that that's the kind of those are the kind of people who probably felt how I felt in the early 2000s, you know, because again, like unfortunately anime, although it's very popular, it's still not known in pop culture kind of
Mm-hmm.
like if you ask like any Joe Blow, like, okay, tell me what Akira is, they'll be like, what the fuck is that? You know,
Mm-hmm.
or tell me about Black Butler. They're like, what's that? You know, but if you ask them like, yeah, tell me about Thor, they're like, oh yeah, I'm so excited for the new movie.
Given that sometimes, or I guess, have you experienced or have you struggled like finding clients that identify as geeks or that benefit from the type of therapy that you give because it's such like a niche sort of thing?
I try to like I try to make sure the name of my private practice incorporates that kind of person. I try to make sure my marketing appeals to that kind of person. So everything about like my messaging, everything about me should be able to somewhat connect to the kind of clients. And so far it's been working. I don't know like how I crack the code. I can't replicate it in any way. All I know is ever since day one, I knew I wanted to work with what I call the others, like someone who just does not fit in their school or with their family. They have these interests, but they don't have anyone to talk to about it. They don't have anyone in their lives that they feel comfortable like showing that side of themselves. And I made sure like in my about me page or you know in all my Instagram posts, like something about that is discussed on some level.
And that's kind of like a similar experience that I've had as well, that since I'm like on social media, I'm like trying to create content for that particular group as well. um i I find that a lot of people are still hesitant to sort of like follow and say anything or comment or anything, but um the more I talk about how I am a geek and how I geek out about things, the more people are like, "Oh, you read fan fiction too?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it's great." And then they're like, "Oh, yeah, me too." Like, I think last year I had a conversation with a friend, and I said something about. I think she was asking me about like my website and stuff, and then so I was explaining it, and I said something about fan fiction, and then she said like, "Oh, I remember being in 8th grade and like closing and locking the door, so like her parents wouldn't know that she was reading fan fiction." And I'm
Oh,
like, and I was like, "Yeah, me too." Like I wouldn't talk to anybody. Like when I was in high school, like I would read it all the time. I never told anybody, like not even my siblings or anybody, because I somehow like nobody around me was talking about it. So I just felt like oh, maybe that's something you don't talk about. Maybe that's something you should be like ashamed of, or like not talk. And then like now that I'm like in this field, and I'm like, no, we all need a like a safe space, like a group of people who understand and are, that we are geeky and we love certain things and they love them as well. And we need a safe space for us to be who we are without being judged.
Yeah, because the way that at least your friend made it sound like she was doing something wrong, you know,
Right. Yeah.
nothing wrong with fan fiction. I get this in like the book world, like, I'm a big fan of like booktube and book TikTok, like love it. But there seems to be this disagreement of like, well, fan fiction isn't real literature, and I'm like, but they're reading, like they're still using that imagination, they're still like enjoying like the written word. Why not, have them explore that? And it's the same thing with like graphic novels and comics. Like, it's not literature. It's like, no, they're still reading. And have you even read, Watchmen? Like, that thing is like history, philosophy, religion, like everything you could possibly get from literature just in one freaking like trade paperback.
Right. Yeah. And like, I think I was reading a post that somebody made, and how they were saying, oh, because there is that like that stigma associated with comic books of, well, if you can't read like longer books with more words or whatever, that's why you read comic books. And I'm like, well, but some of the, like, I learned so many words from reading comic books that I didn't learn from reading all the other books, because it's like, it's a different world. It's a different way that, that you have only like a really small space for you to communicate all of this. And so you use like different words, and I'm like, it's a different form, but yeah, you're still reading, you're still learning. There's so much like that we can get out of like watching movies or cartoons, or reading things that are not like, you know Nobel Prize or whatever.
Well, way I look at it, I can't help but think like when Homer back in the day was like writing the Iliad, because he was the first guy to be like, you know what, all these like poems and all these songs that we like recite by memory, let's actually write it down onto like some paper, and the whole concept of writing was starting with him. And I can't help but think like someone was commenting like, okay, but we're fine with just memorizing and resuscitation. Why are you writing it down? So someone's going to judge no matter like how media or history or whatever is consumed. Like, someone's always going to comment. I remember there's a conversation about how Netflix may be diluting the whole film industry, but it's just a new way of consuming media. Because I know when I was in college, I could have benefited from more streaming sites, but it just wasn't there yet. Technology wasn't there. But if you really wanted to enjoy a movie, you had to go to the movies. You had to, back in the day it was like Blockbuster, but if you didn't have those funds, you would be like eliminated from the opportunity of watching those films. And that's a whole population missing out on great media.
Right. Yeah. And I grew up in like this sort of like small town in the middle of nowhere. We have one grocery store and a handful of like mom and pop shops and restaurants. We don't have a movie theater here. And like when we were younger, like it was like really hard for my parents to find time for us to go to the mall, which is like half an hour away. And so we didn't have, I mean, the only thing we had was cartoons. So I was like, yeah, that's how I bonded with my brothers, like watching cartoons Saturday morning or like after school. And then like as adults now we went to watch movies together. But it's just, you're right, it makes things be a lot more accessible to everyone.
And I think that's why Homer decided to write things down. Because unless you were living in his village or in his city, you wouldn't know these stories. And they were very important stories. And that's why we have Homer. That's why we have the Iliad and, the Odyssey. And that's what shaped all like these wonderful stories about the great hero's journey, which everyone follows. Like, find me any superhero movie, I can guarantee, it follows the hero's journey,
Mhm.
but we wouldn't have that unless it was written down. And centuries later, decades later, we could be like, oh, this is what it meant for this particular time period. Why wouldn't we have that?
Wait, I have one more question. I completely forgot. Um, Oh yeah. So we're geeking out, which is fantastic. But I wanted to ask you if you had any sort of advice that you would give to people who are thinking about opening their own private practice and doing geek therapy, or like incorporating elements of geek culture into their sessions.
As for like the geek culture, like just own it. Just be yourself. Like don't be ashamed of it. It's nothing to be ashamed of. There's a lot of us out here. I'm hoping like, after this podcast or more interviews like this, like people will start to know like geek therapy is a thing. And I think at least in our field, there's always this conversation of, well, is it evidence-based? And evidence-based is like, it's great, but it doesn't work for everyone, you know?
Mm.
And there's even more research coming out that like what we know as evidence-based, like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or dialectical behavioral therapy, it's not meant for people of color or women of color. It was built for like affluent 40-something-year-old men, much like the medical model that we know of now. So if geek culture can kind of bridge the gap, or it helps therapists like us understand our client, why wouldn't we want to utilize that? Because what we know is evidence-based may not do that for us.
Well, and even then, like I sit and think about it, and I'm like, we're still using evidence-based. We're just dressing it up, like talking about superheroes and comic books and movies. Like we're still like talking about that connection. We're still, talking about goals and, being interested in the client focused, centered. Like we're still using that. It just doesn't look like it because we're dressing it up a little bit differently.
And with CBT, like at least like if you're following it like module by module, it's not built for everyone. I can guarantee like people are not going to be able to sit with their thoughts and their feelings the way that at least the textbook wants us to. So that's why we need like the geek therapy stuff to kind of come in and say, well, if this doesn't speak to you, then maybe this will, and hopefully there will be like a way to bridge the gap. And that's why I'm hopeful, at least in this field. And I think the pandemic is a great leveler, because now more people of color, more people with different backgrounds have access to mental health services. So now it's like, oh, okay, so the stuff that we're realizing that worked for this population may not work for this. So now we need to get creative and create new stuff, innovate a little bit more, pivot. We need to, and I'm very excited for it. As for opening your private practice, again, don't do what I did. Do not start with clients and hope for the best. It was not my best idea. It worked for me, but I got lucky and I don't know how. So I would definitely, be a little bit more patient. And that's my own flaw. Like I'm not the most patient person, especially when I have a goal in mind. I'm always like, what I got to do today? Like power through. What's the next step? Like how do I achieve the next thing? That thing is more of it's that obsession with like, I got to be productive. Like, what am I doing? I had to follow my own advice and say, no, I don't need to like work 80 hours anymore. I don't need to like put in that extra effort if I don't have the bandwidth. It's okay. Instead, I'll go play. So my way of playing was like, okay, how do I just learn from like the community I do know? Like who can I reach out to? And that's why I joined a few directories. That's why I went on YouTube. That's why I like read the articles I read. Do your research and then save, because they don't tell you about the licensing fees and the business fees it takes to open a business like this. And just take your time. There's no one pushing you, or there's no expectation to like have a full caseload right when you open your doors.
That's great, because that's what I thought needed to happen in order to keep the business afloat.
Yeah. So if you're lucky enough or privileged enough to like have a job, stay at that job just a little bit longer, but definitely have an exit strategy. If it needs to take 6 months to a year, that's how long it takes. Build your caseload, however long you need that to be. There is no like, well, I need to do this in 3 weeks. No one's really saying that. We feel that pressure because we got to like, maybe we got to prove something. Maybe there's something else driving that motivation. But right now, you could go at your own pace. And if it takes a year, it takes a year.
Did you go from working for somebody else to then opening your private practice full time, or did you start part time?
So what I did, I left my nonprofit. Again, I had the 2 clients and I'm like, this is not going to be enough. I'm going into like, I think it was like right before the summer. And I'm like, okay, that's generally when it's hard to find teen clients because, they're out of school. They're probably not as stressed. Like mental health stuff probably isn't happening as much, or they're just going on vacation. They're taking that time to like relax with their family. So I decided to apply to like a contract job. It's another telehealth. It's not BetterHelp, but it's kind of like a BetterHelp, but it's just ethical. It's an ethical business. They really try to specialize with teens and young adults. The only thing was it was a contract job, so no benefits. You only work as much as you want. And that just appealed to me at the time. So for a while that paid my rent. And I was just trying to find ways on like, how do I get new clients on this other, my private practice. So I was able to balance out the 2.
Okay. And then, so for your private practice now, you're sort of like advertising online and thinking about joining some panels is what you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm just trying to step up the whole like marketing, Instagram thing, like social media presence. Still learning what that is, because again, they don't teach you that. But what I keep hearing is that whole like barrier that like you're a blank slate between you and your client, that can go away now. Like that, there doesn't have to be that barrier anymore. So you can show more of yourself. So that's why I emphasize like, the geek therapy. Like this is what I'm interested in because that's what I feel safe talking about online.
And that's very true. I feel like when I was looking for therapist, it was just a lot easier for me to reach out to someone um, when they had like a bio or they had like some sort of social media presence, because then I could sort of like figure out who they were and whether or not we were going to be a good fit. And I'm like, we can't be like blank slates, because then nobody's going to want to come and talk to us because they're like, oh, they don't care. Or like, you can't connect with someone who's not showing any emotions or anything like that. um so I am well, I'm all over social media, so I think you guys figure it out that I do think it's a great way for us to sort of like talk more about mental health, like start those conversations that maybe in the past nobody really wanted to talk about. And I know that a lot of people are still sort of like debating whether or not they want to do therapy or reach out to someone. So I'm like, well, in the meantime, you know, here are some resources for you, because there's a lot. I noticed in social media, there's a lot of resources and information about mental health, but most of that is coming from artists and like social media influencers, but it's not really coming from professionals. So I was like, oh, we need to change that. We need to be out there like setting straight that information, because that's how misinformation happens, right? Like people don't really understand what's going on and are trying to guide others or give advice when they're not fully trained for something like that.
Yeah, and I think these influencers are well-meaning. Like I think they're trying to destigmatize mental health. I think that's the intent.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember like when Netflix decided to make 13 Reasons Why a series,
Oh.
And there was that controversy about like, should they be showing this? Should they really be like, this blunt about it? Because let's face it, the book was, for some was really intense, but the to add the visual,
Mm.
especially on Netflix. And I just kept asking myself, like, should Netflix be really having this conversation? And they had the professionals, they had, a lot of PhD people like talk about like, this is what happened in this episode, like, please reach out for help. They took the responsible route. But I'm like, it's still Netflix. Like, should they be the ones asking parents to talk to their kids about this stuff? And I go back and forth. If we're talking about accessibility, maybe that's the only way, this person can have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
again with Disney, like, you know, as much as I praise them for doing stuff like Encanto or Turning Red, like, I don't know, there's always this potential risk of like, should these companies be the ones, you know, asking people like, hey, this is what's going on.
Right. And I think for me, at least part of that comes from the fact that uh, our profession hasn't been shown in the best of light in most movies or for like ever. Not really. So, I mean, I can't really think of an example where the mental health provider was actually a good influence or like a good person um, in the movie. So,
The only one that comes to my mind, there's like this therapist on Law and Order SVU.
hmm.
He's been the only competent one that I could like, you actually did your job okay. You know, I wouldn't have asked it that way, but okay. At least like, you're not like trying to sleep with your client, you know, like
Mm,
that's where some of these shows go. But this particular therapist, okay, you're fine.
yeah. So yeah, it is a good thing, I guess, that there's the conversation that is going or starting with like some of these movies and stuff. But I think there needs to be that's when we, I think, as a field, need to take a bit more responsibility. I understand the fact that we need to keep confidentiality and all that, but at the same time, we need to be providing that information for people to prevent, miscommunication and misunderstanding, and to eliminate that stigma that you have to do it all yourself, or you don't have to reach out to a therapist, or every therapist you reach out to is gonna be mean or tell you what to do, or whatever it is that most movies show that happens when you reach out to a therapist.
Yeah, and I think that's why another reason the pandemic made a mental health like a great, like it kind of leveled it out, because it's online. Like more people had to, it's no longer a big secret. Like normally when people think of therapy, it's like, oh, you like go to someone's office and you have to like close the door and you have to sit on their couch and, bare your soul. That's social media has shown like that's not the only way, because people are more than happy to show like, no, there's play therapy, you can do creative writing, you can do group therapy, like there's all these new, I don't know, it's becoming very innovative now, because geek therapy is that. I would say like it's because we're having these conversations about the kind of therapies we do, people are not assuming like, oh, it's just me sitting on a couch talking about my dreams.
Right. There doesn't need to be a couch. We can sit on the floor if you want, or you can sit in your living room, or wherever space you feel the safest to have that conversation, with someone.
Or go for a walk. During the pandemic, I knew a few therapists who were like meeting people in their car, like they parked their cars next to each other and were talking through Bluetooth. Like people got creative over the pandemic because they knew this was still important, but going to someone's office just wasn't going to be the way anymore.
So if somebody is interested in reaching out to you, where can they wait? Just to clarify, do you only provide services for someone who's in the state of California?
Yes, I'm only licensed in California, but I can see anyone in the state of California. I'm currently located in the Bay Area, San Francisco, San Mateo County. But if you're like in LA or San Diego, I can meet you online.
So where can they find you at?
So you can go to my website, todostherapy.com. You can also go to my Instagram, which is at TODOS Therapy. And I have a Facebook, but I doubt like young people really use Facebook nowadays. But if you want to find me on there, at TODOS Therapy as well. So yeah.
Okay. So, and I'll write that information as well on the post for anybody who's interested in reaching out.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation. I think I got to geek out a lot more than ask you questions, but I think it was great, and you gave us a lot of really awesome information for those of us who are wanting to start like or private practice in the future. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And yeah, let's keep having these conversations. People out here need the help, and yeah, and it's okay to be a geek. I think that's my big message. Like, just be okay being a geek. It's cool.
Right. Yes, it is cool to be a geek. There you go. I hope you guys enjoyed that video, and I have a bunch more planned for you guys. I have a couple that are like Marvel themed and a couple for cartoons, and I have, of course, more interviews with people about their own experience opening up their own private practice, and also the Avatar RPG. So if you guys are interested in that, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. You can also check out my social media at Superpower Toolkit. So that's super PWR Toolkit, and my website, psychologyforgeeks.com.